Imagine a time not so different from our own, where a dominant power sought to impose its singular vision upon a diverse world. An era when ancient traditions were deemed obsolete, replaced by the gleaming, seductive promises of a new, unified culture. Picture the great empire of Cygnus, its influence stretching across continents, its legions marching to the rhythm of progress, its emperor, known only as the architect, dreaming of a perfectly harmonious realm, purged of stubborn, anachronistic beliefs. And within the vast reach of Cygnus lay a small, defiant people, the children of the covenant. They clung to their ancient texts, their peculiar customs, their unseen God. Their capital city, the high-walled stronghold known as Zion, was a beacon of this resistance, centered around a sacred structure they called the sanctuary. The architect, seeing this as a disruptive anomaly in his grand design, dispatched his most ruthless enforcer, Governor Helios, with a chilling mandate: dismantle their faith, assimilate their culture, erase their identity. Governor Helios arrived in Zion with the force of an iron fist. His decree was swift and brutal. The sacred scrolls of the covenant were seized and publicly incinerated, their wisdom turned to ash in the city squares. Their ancient laws were outlawed, their Sabbath rest a punishable offense. The sanctuary, the heart of their faith, was desecrated, transformed into a shrine for the empire's pantheon. Dominated by the imposing statue of the Sky Father, Cygnus's chief deity. The ultimate test came when Helios's heralds proclaimed the emperor's command. Every family was to offer sacrifice to the Sky Father at specially erected altars. For the children of the covenant, this was not merely a religious observance, it was an act of absolute betrayal to their unseen God, a line drawn in blood and fire. To cross it meant severing their connection to the covenant. To refuse meant certain, agonizing death. The air in Zion grew thick with fear and despair. Whispers spread of neighbors yielding, of families breaking under the pressure, choosing survival over conviction. The city, once vibrant with the rhythms of their faith, felt muted, cloaked in a suffocating silence of unspoken terror. The choice mirrored trials faced by the faithful throughout history, the stark decision between bowing to earthly power or standing firm for the divine, even when the cost was everything. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting to see if the light of their ancient faith would be utterly extinguished. But even in the deepest darkness, a single spark can ignite a blaze. In a quiet village, tucked away from the main arteries of Cygnus's control, lived a family of priests, fiercely devoted to the old ways. At their head was Mattathias, a man whose grey beard held the wisdom of generations and whose eyes still burned with the fire of unwavering faith. He watched as Helios's officials, accompanied by Cygnus legions, arrived in his village, dragging a makeshift altar into the central square. The command was given, sharp and cold: offer sacrifice or face the consequences. The air hung heavy. Villagers averted their gaze, torn between fear and the deep-seated knowledge of what this act represented. Then, one figure stepped forward, a man from the village who had clearly chosen to comply, perhaps hoping to set an example, to ease the pressure. He approached the altar, the designated offering in his trembling hands, ready to betray the covenant to save his skin. Mattathias watched, his heart a forge of conflicting emotions: sorrow for the man's weakness, righteous fury at the empire's audacity, and an unyielding resolve that this desecration would not stand, not here, not now. He felt an ancient zeal surge within him, echoes of prophets and heroes who had stood for the holiness of their God. In that critical, charged moment, where silence might have meant the slow death of their faith, Mattathias cried out, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. His words were not a plea, but a declaration. Whoever is zealous for the law and maintains the covenant, let him come out after me. Then, with a speed that belied his years, Mattathias lunged, not at the officials, not at the legions first, but at the man about to offer the sacrifice. It was a swift, brutal act, a public, irreversible rejection of compromise. With his own hand, Mattathias struck the compromiser down at the very altar of the Sky Father. The gasp from the crowd was immediate, a collective shockwave. The Cygnus officials roared, their faces contorted in disbelief and rage. The legions moved to apprehend him. But Mattathias didn't stop there. Fueled by that same righteous fire, he turned his weapon, a simple, unassuming blade he had kept hidden, upon the Cygnus official who had dared to enforce the impious decree. Blood stained the stones of the village square, not from sacrifice to a false god, but from an act of desperate sacred defiance. This single, audacious act was more than just a desperate outburst. It was a challenge thrown down, a line drawn in the most visceral way possible. It declared for all to see that the faith of the children of the covenant was not yet dead. It ignited something that had been simmering beneath the surface of fear, the embers of courage, the deep memory of their identity, the fierce loyalty to their unseen God. The rebellion of the children of the covenant had begun, not with strategic planning or vast armies, but with one old man, standing firm in his faith, choosing the echo of ancient zeal over the silence of submission. The fight to preserve their religious identity, their very existence as a distinct people, was now inevitable. The iron fist of Cygnus had met the unyielding force of a faith pushed to the brink. Mattathias's act of defiance sent shockwaves through the land. It was an impossible spark in a suffocating darkness. The Cygnus legions, enraged by the killing of their official and the public humiliation, descended upon the village with swift, brutal retribution. Homes were burned, and those who could not flee were shown no mercy. Mattathias and his sons, marked men, were forced to abandon their home and seek refuge in the rugged, unforgiving wilderness. They became fugitives, hunted by the vast military machine of the Cygnus Empire, but the fire that Mattathias had ignited did not die. It spread like wildfire through the underground networks of the children of the covenant, reaching those who had secretly mourned the desecration of the sanctuary and the suppression of their faith. The fugitives in the wilderness became a rallying point, a symbol of hope for a people who had felt utterly powerless. Mattathias, though physically weakened by the harsh conditions of the wilderness and the strain of leadership, spent his remaining days organizing the nascent resistance. He knew this was not a conventional war, it was a fight for the soul of his people. Before his death, he passed the torch of leadership to his sons, specifically highlighting the strength and courage of one in particular, Judas. Judas, a name that would soon become synonymous with defiance and miraculous victory. He was known among his brothers and the early followers as the Hammer, a nickname that spoke of his unyielding resolve and his ability to strike hard against seemingly insurmountable obstacles. With Mattathias gone, Judas took command of their small, ill-equipped band of fighters. These were not trained soldiers. They were priests, farmers, tradesmen, men whose primary training had been in the law and the rituals of the sanctuary, not the arts of war. Their weapons were often makeshift, their numbers tragically few compared to the professional, disciplined legions of Cygnus. The situation was desperate. Governor Helios, furious that this anomaly had not been immediately crushed, dispatched formidable forces to hunt them down. Reports came in of Cygnus armies, numbering in the tens of thousands, clad in polished armor, armed with superior weapons, supported by cavalry and even war, elephants, the terrifying, living tanks of the ancient battlefield. Against this overwhelming might stood Judas and his small, ragged band, perhaps numbering only a few thousand at their strongest moments. Logic dictated immediate surrender, or at best, guerrilla skirmishes intended only to harass the enemy. But Judas operated on a different logic, the logic of faith. He understood that this was not merely a military conflict, but a spiritual one. Their strength would not come from numbers or weaponry, but from the unseen power of their God. Before every engagement, Judas would gather his fighters. There were no elaborate war drums or stirring martial music in their hidden camps. Instead, there were prayers. Earnest, heartfelt cries to the God of their ancestors, the God who had parted seas, brought down walls, and delivered his people from slavery. They knew the stories of Gideon, who with a tiny army of 300, armed with trumpets and torches, routed a vast Midianite horde. These weren't just ancient tales. They were blueprints for faith in the face of the impossible. One of the first major confrontations was at a place called Emmaus. Governor Helios sent a large army, confident they would easily sweep away the rebels. Judas and his men were vastly outnumbered. The air thrummed with the presence of the enemy, their polished armor glinting under the sun. Fear, cold and sharp, was a palpable entity among the children of the covenant. Seeing the multitude of the enemy stretching out before them, Judas turned to his men. His face, etched with the hardships of the wilderness, was nonetheless alight with a fierce, quiet conviction. He didn't downplay the danger, but he immediately redirected their gaze, not to the overwhelming force, but to the unseen power above. "Let us not fear the numbers," Judas called out, his voice steady, "but trust in the Lord of heaven, who is mighty to save in battle." 1 Maccabees 3:18, quoted in the original text. He led them in prayer, reminding God of his past deliverances, acknowledging their weakness and their complete reliance on his strength. Then, with a boldness that astonished the Cygnus commanders, Judas led his small force into battle. The ensuing engagements were not conventional military victories. They were, time and time again, demonstrations of something far beyond human capacity. Ambushes in narrow mountain passes that favored the smaller force, sudden storms that blinded the larger army, moments of confusion and panic sown within the enemy ranks that defied military logic. In the chaos of battle, the Cygnus legions, trained to fight organized units, found themselves baffled and demoralized by the unpredictable, fiercely motivated rebels who seemed to appear and disappear like phantoms, striking with the sudden, unexpected force of a hammer. Judas, wielding his weapon with skill and ferocity, fought on the front lines, a whirlwind of righteous fury. His presence inspired his men, who saw in him not just a leader, but a vessel of divine purpose. They fought with the desperation of those defending not just their lives, but their very right to believe. Battle after battle, Beth Horon, Emmaus, Beth Zur, and others, saw the impossible happen. The Cygnus armies, despite their numerical superiority and military expertise, were routed, their confidence shattered, their ranks decimated. Judas and his forces, against all calculations, drove the empire's soldiers back, reclaiming territory, pushing the iron fist of Cygnus back from the heart of their land. These victories were not celebrated as triumphs of military strategy alone. They were seen, felt, and declared as miracles, signs that the unseen God of the covenant was actively fighting for his people. The stories of these battles, where the few overcame the many, where faith defied brute force, became legendary. The name, Judas Maccabeus, echoed not just as a military leader, but as a testament to the power of unwavering faith in the face of overwhelming odds. The spark of defiance had become a roaring flame, fueled by divine intervention on the battlefield. While Judas Maccabeus and his warriors achieved astonishing victories on the battlefield, driving back the legions of Governor Helios, the iron fist of the Cygnus Empire did not relent. The architect's decree remained absolute. The faith of the children of the covenant must be crushed. These military defeats only fueled the empire's cruelty, leading to intensified persecution in the cities and towns still under direct Cygnus control. The conflict moved beyond pitched battles, descending into a brutal campaign against individuals, families, and the very symbols of their identity. In this grim reality, the stories of resistance took on a different, perhaps even more profound, dimension. Not everyone could wield a sword or fight in the mountains. For many, the battlefield was a Cygnus interrogation chamber, a public square turned execution ground. Here, their courage was tested not by the clash of steel, but by the unwavering strength of their conviction against unimaginable torment. These were the martyrs, those who chose agonizing death rather than renounce their unseen God or violate his sacred law. Their stories were whispered in hidden gatherings, passed along with the smuggled fragments of the old scrolls. They were tales of units facing horrific tortures, flaying, burning, mutilation, yet refusing to utter a single word of compromise. But one account echoed with a particular heart-wrenching power, a testament to a faith that looked beyond the agony of the present moment. It was the story of a mother and her 7 sons. Their names were not recorded in the texts widely circulated later, but their sacrifice became legendary within the unseen network. Seized by Cygnus officials, they were brought before a high-ranking tribune, a man whose cold eyes had witnessed countless acts of broken will. The command was simple: eat forbidden food, touch the impious idols, perform a simple gesture of allegiance to the sky. Father, just a small act, they were told, and they would live. Refusal meant death, administered one by one, in front of their family, designed to break the spirit of the survivors. The eldest son was brought forward first. He refused. His torment was swift and brutal, his body subjected to unspeakable cruelty. Yet, even as his life faded, his voice, though broken, was filled with a fierce, unwavering declaration. He spoke not of pain, but of hope. He declared that the King of the universe, the unseen God, would raise them up to everlasting life because they died for his laws. Then the second, the third, and so on. Each son, witnessing the agony of his brother, was given the same choice, the same opportunity to save himself. And each son, in turn, refused. Their resolve hardened, not by their own strength, but by a shared, burning conviction. Their final words were defiance, trust, and a chilling anticipation of a future beyond death. And there, amidst this horror, stood the mother. The tribune watched her, expecting her will to shatter, anticipating her pleas for her sons to yield. But he underestimated the depth of her faith. This mother, who had carried them, nurtured them, taught them the ancient law, now stood as a pillar of strength, her heart a furnace of sorrow and magnificent courage. Her spirit mirrored the resilience of Hannah, who had dedicated her only son Samuel to God's service, despite her longing for him. But this mother's trial was infinitely more severe. She watched, one by one, as her flesh and blood were taken from her in the most brutal way imaginable. Yet, in those final, gut-wrenching moments with her last surviving son, her voice was not one of despair, but of powerful, unshakable faith. She encouraged him not to save himself, but to follow his brothers, reminding him of the source of their life, of the promise of resurrection, and the ultimate justice that awaited them beyond the veil of death. "Do not fear this butcher," she urged her youngest, her voice clear despite the tears. "But prove yourself worthy of your brothers. Accept death, so that in the time of mercy I may get you back again with your brothers." 2 Maccabees 7:29, a paraphrase reflecting the text's emphasis. Her words were a thunderclap of faith in the face of absolute darkness. For in these accounts from 2 Maccabees, the belief in resurrection becomes a central, animating force, while hints of life after death appeared elsewhere in their ancient texts, like Daniel 12. Here it was explicit, a tangible hope that empowered ordinary people to endure unimaginable suffering. The martyrs faced their gruesome ends with a profound confidence that their unseen God would raise them up, restoring what had been lost, rewarding their faithfulness in a world to come. This conviction, this radical hope in life beyond the grave, was a foundational element of their Pharisaic tradition and eerily prefigured the very cornerstone of Christian theology, later articulated by figures like Paul, Matthew 22, 1 Corinthians 15. The martyrs of 2 Maccabees, in their willingness to die for the law with the sure hope of resurrection, were indeed forerunners, their sacrifice a powerful, bloody prophecy. But 2 Maccabees also recounts more familiar forms of divine intervention, particularly on the battlefield. Even as Judas Maccabeus led his men, facing overwhelming Cygnus forces, moments of supernatural aid were reported, reinforcing the belief that their God was actively engaged in their struggle. One such moment occurred during a desperate battle near Beth Zur. Judas's forces were cornered, vastly outnumbered, facing certain annihilation. The air vibrated with the enemy's approach, their war elephants trumpeting, their legions a seemingly endless wave. Just as despair threatened to engulf the defenders, something extraordinary happened. Witnesses later described a sudden, brilliant light that momentarily stunned the enemy lines. Then, appearing as if from the heavens themselves, 5 magnificent figures on horseback, their mounts adorned with what seemed like harness of pure gold. They were not men. They were radiant, awe-inspiring, protectors sent by the unseen God. These angelic warriors positioned themselves around Judas Maccabeus, shielding him from harm, their presence a tangible barrier against the enemy's assault. But their role was not merely defensive. With swift, devastating force, they unleashed what seemed like bolts of lightning and showers of celestial arrows upon the Cygnus ranks. Confusion erupted. The disciplined legions broke, their formation dissolving into chaos as they were struck by an unseen, terrifying power. The war elephants, normally unstoppable, trumpeted in panic and turned against their own handlers. The battle, moments before a guaranteed defeat for the children of the covenant, swung violently in their favor. When the battle became fierce, the account reads, 5 splendid men on horses with golden bridles appeared to lead the Jews. They took Maccabeus in their midst, and shielding him with their armor, they kept him from being wounded. They showered arrows and lightning on the enemy, throwing them into confusion. 2 Maccabees 10:29-30 quoted directly. This breathtaking scene echoed other moments of divine armies fighting for God's people in ancient lore, like Elisha's servant seeing the chariots of fire in 2 Kings 6. It was a powerful, visceral reminder to the children of the covenant and to future generations that even when earthly odds were insurmountable, the armies of heaven were ready to intervene when faith and righteousness were on the line. Another instance of divine guidance came to Judas personally. As he prepared for a crucial battle, burdened by the weight of leadership and the scale of the task, he received a vision. In this spiritual encounter, the revered prophet Jeremiah, long passed from this world, appeared to him. Jeremiah, a symbol of enduring faithfulness despite suffering, extended his hand and presented Judas with a magnificent golden sword. "Take this holy sword," the spectral prophet instructed, "a gift from God with which you will strike down your adversaries." 2 Maccabees 15:16 quoted directly. This was more than a weapon. It was a tangible assurance of divine favor and future victory. The vision infused Judas with courage and conviction, confirming that his cause was just and that God's power would be with him in the fight. It was a moment reminiscent of Joshua's encounter with the commander of the Lord's army, Joshua 5, solidifying leadership and confirming divine presence before embarking on a seemingly impossible task. 2 Maccabees is a raw, emotional account that elevates the cost of faith and the extraordinary power of God's response. It weaves together the agonizing reality of martyrdom with the glorious promise of resurrection and the awe-inspiring spectacle of divine intervention on the battlefield. The martyrs who gave their lives for the sacred law did so not in despair, but in the firm belief that their suffering was not the end and that they would be vindicated in the afterlife. And the miraculous battles served as undeniable proof that even when outnumbered and outmatched by earthly empires, those who stood with the unseen God never stood alone. These stories, particularly the emphasis on martyrdom and resurrection, would profoundly influence early Christian thought, inspiring believers for centuries to face suffering and death with unwavering hope. But as powerful and bloody as these accounts are, the story of the children of the covenant and their God's remarkable interventions does not end here. A different kind of threat and a different kind of deliverance awaited them far from the battlefields of Zion. While the children of the covenant in the land of Zion fought the iron fist of the empire of Cygnus under Judas Maccabeus, their kin scattered across the vast world faced different challenges. Many lived in the sprawling cities of other powerful kingdoms, maintaining their unique identity and faith amidst diverse populations. One such place was the realm of the Serpent dynasty, centered in the magnificent, ancient land of Egypt. Here, the children of the covenant lived under the rule of King Apex, a monarch renowned for his strategic cunning and absolute authority. Their life here was one of uneasy coexistence, a delicate balance maintained through adherence to the Serpent dynasty's laws, while quietly upholding the covenant's sacred traditions. The relative peace was shattered after King Apex achieved a significant military victory against a rival kingdom, perhaps the Lion Kingdom from the north. Flush with triumph and inflated with a sense of invincible power, King Apex turned his gaze towards the sacred practices of the peoples under his dominion. He heard tales of the children of the covenant's unwavering devotion to their distant sanctuary in Zion, of its hidden, most sacred chamber, the Holy of Holies, which even their own high priests could only enter on a single day each year. Driven by arrogance and a perverse curiosity to possess what was deemed off-limits, King Apex, despite the counsel of his advisors and the protests of the local children of the covenant, resolved to personally enter the Holy of Holies during a visit to Zion. His intention was clear: to demonstrate his ultimate authority, his power transcending even religious boundaries. He marched towards the sacred veil, his guards flanking him, his face set in a mask of arrogant determination, ignoring the pleas and silent terror of the priests who stood trembling before the entrance. But as his hand reached out, ready to pull back the sacred curtain, an unseen force intervened. It was not a physical barrier, not a guard spear, but a sudden, overwhelming wave of divine power. King Apex was instantly struck down. His limbs went rigid, seized by inexplicable paralysis. His vision, moments before fixed on the sacred veil, was consumed by blinding darkness. He crumpled to the ground, a figure of absolute helplessness, surrounded by his stunned and terrified guards. He was dragged away, thwarted and humiliated, prevented from his act of sacrilege by a power far greater than his own. Returning to his capital, the glittering city of Alexandria, King Apex's humiliation festered, twisting into a cold, venomous rage. His public display of divine reprimand could not be ignored. He attributed his affliction not to his sacrilege, but to the stubborn, insolent God of the children of the covenant, and by extension, to all his followers within his own realm. This wasn't just about a sacred site anymore, it was personal. His decree followed, chilling in its calculated cruelty. All children of the covenant throughout the Serpent dynasty were to be rounded up, registered, their names entered into a grim ledger. Each person was to be branded, marked for easy identification, like livestock destined for slaughter. His final command was horrific. They were to be gathered in the grand stadium of Alexandria for a public spectacle, a mass execution designed to break the spirit of any who dared defy his will. The method? They were to be trampled to death by war elephants. The news swept through the communities of the children of the covenant in Egypt like a death knell. Fear, raw and paralyzing, seized them. They were not warriors like Judas Maccabeus' men. They were merchants, scribes, laborers, families. They were surrounded, trapped within the cities of the Serpent dynasty, with no army to defend them. Their situation felt terrifyingly similar to the plight of their ancestors centuries before, facing the wrath of a different pharaoh in this very land. Total annihilation seemed imminent. Yet, in the face of this seemingly insurmountable threat, the children of the covenant in Egypt did not resort to plotting rebellion or attempting armed resistance. They turned to their only remaining weapon, the one passed down through generations of trial and deliverance: prayer and fasting. Throughout Alexandria and beyond, hidden homes became places of fervent supplication. Families gathered, their voices low but filled with desperate hope. They remembered the stories of the Red Sea, of manna in the wilderness, of deliverance from fiery furnaces and lions' dens. They recalled how their ancestors, enslaved in Egypt, had cried out to their God, and he had heard them, responding with mighty signs and wonders that broke the power of an empire. They remembered how Esther, facing a similar plot of genocide in Persia, had called for a communal fast before she acted. With tears streaming down their faces, with bellies empty but spirits focused, they poured out their hearts to the unseen God. They confessed their failings, but pleaded for his mercy, reminding him of his covenant with their fathers and his promises to protect his people. Their collective prayer rose like incense, a desperate, unified cry for divine intervention. They had no physical defense, no strategic escape route. Their only hope rested entirely on the power of their God to act. Their faith, forged in generations of trial, was being tested in the most extreme crucible. They believed, against all visible evidence, that their God was not confined to the land of Zion, but that his power extended even to the heart of the serpent dynasty, that he could deliver them even from the very jaws of death. As King Apex's horrifying plan moved towards its brutal conclusion, the stage was set in Alexandria's vast stadium. The city's population gathered, some perhaps with morbid curiosity, others with cruel anticipation. The children of the covenant, numbering in the tens of thousands, were herded into the center of the arena, surrounded by heavily armed guards. The air thrummed with tension, the trumpeting roars of the massive war elephants, adding a terrifying soundtrack to the unfolding horror. The elephants, conditioned for battle and trained to crush, were brought forward, ready to be driven into the defenseless crowd. The moment arrived. The signal was given. The handlers urged the colossal beasts forward, towards the waiting multitude of the children of the covenant. The fate of an entire people hung in the balance. The trumpeting war elephants, magnificent and terrifying in their brute power, began their charge. The ground trembled under their colossal weight. The air filled with the sounds of the crowd, a mixture of anticipation and horror. The children of the covenant, huddled together in the center of the stadium, their faces turned upwards, not in defiance of the beasts, but in desperate, silent prayer to their unseen God, braced for the inevitable, agonizing impact. They had no shields, no weapons, no escape, only their faith, their fasting, and the collective cry they had sent heavenward. King Apex watched from his royal box, a cruel smile playing on his lips, anticipating the gruesome spectacle that would solidify his absolute power and avenge his earlier humiliation at the sanctuary. His legions stood ready to ensure no one escaped the planned slaughter. The handlers, trained to control the war elephants with sharp prodding instruments and harsh commands, drove the beasts forward, their massive feet kicking up dust that swirled towards the trapped population. Then, just as the lead elephants were mere moments from crashing into the first ranks of the children of the covenant, something extraordinary, something utterly miraculous, occurred. It began subtly, a slight hesitation in the lead elephant's charge, then a sudden violent jerk of its head. Its eyes, previously fixed on the target, rolled back, filled not with controlled aggression, but with inexplicable terror. A low rumble escaped its massive chest, a sound of distress. The handlers, confused, urged it forward more forcefully. But the beast did not obey. Instead, with a sudden, panicked roar that dwarfed its previous trumpeting, it reared back on its hind legs, throwing its handlers into disarray. The elephants behind it reacted instantaneously, catching the wave of fear and confusion. They didn't just stop, they turned. Not towards the helpless crowd of the children of the covenant, but in a sudden, terrifying stampede, back towards their own handlers and the surrounding Cygnus legions. Chaos erupted. The sheer mass and power of the panicked elephants became a force of unintended destruction for the Serpent Dynasty's own military. Handlers were crushed beneath their own beasts. Soldiers, caught off guard, were trampled underfoot, their polished armor no protection against the blind terror of the stampeding giants. The well-ordered ranks of King Apex's legions, moments before confident executors of a brutal decree, dissolved into a scene of pandemonium, screaming soldiers desperately trying to flee the very creatures they controlled. The stadium, meant to be a stage for the king's power, became a swirling vortex of dust, panic, and unintended carnage. The children of the Covenant, who had braced for death, stood stunned, watching as their would-be destroyers became the instrument of their own army's disarray. It was a reversal so sudden, so absolute, so utterly beyond human explanation, that it could only be understood as a direct, powerful act of divine intervention. The unseen God, the God who had heard their desperate prayers and seen their unwavering faith, had answered. He had not sent an army of men, but had used the very tools of the oppressor, the symbols of earthly power, to achieve his deliverance. Just as he had sent plagues to break the will of Pharaoh and used the waves of the Red Sea to drown the Egyptian army, he now used the war elephants, intended for death, as agents of chaos and rescue. King Apex, watching from his box, saw his cruel spectacle transform into a horrifying disaster. His face, moments before alight with anticipation, was now contorted in disbelief and fury. His plan had not only failed spectacularly, but it had resulted in the destruction of his own forces and a public demonstration that his power was nothing compared to the unseen force that controlled even the mightiest beasts. The stampede continued until the panic subsided, and the remaining elephants were eventually brought under control, leaving behind a scene of devastation among King Apex's soldiers. The children of the Covenant remained unharmed, protected by an invisible shield more formidable than any wall or armor. The implications were undeniable. The Serpent Dynasty and its arrogant king had just witnessed the manifest power of the God of the Covenant. This deity was not confined to a distant sanctuary in Zion. His power extended across the seas into the very heart of Egypt, capable of overturning the most meticulously planned acts of tyranny with a single, astonishing command over creation itself. This event echoed the visions granted to Daniel centuries before, illustrating that earthly kingdoms rise and fall, their power temporary and fragile, while the kingdom and sovereignty of the Most High endure forever. Daniel 2. King Apex, like Pharaoh and Nebuchadnezzar before him, had learned a terrifying lesson. God's hand cannot be stayed by human arrogance or military might. Humiliated and shaken to his core, his authority severely undermined by the public display of divine power, King Apex was forced to concede. He issued a new decree, not of persecution, but of deliverance and religious freedom. The children of the Covenant in Egypt were released from registration, their brands removed, their lives spared. They were granted permission to practice their faith openly, without fear of interference. The king, defeated not by swords but by the sovereign hand, acknowledged that their God had intervened in ways that defied all human explanation and military logic. The deliverance of the children of the Covenant in Egypt, though less known than the military victories of Judas Maccabeus, carries the same profound message. It is a testament to the power of faith beyond circumstance, of hope in the face of utter helplessness, and of the incredible responsiveness of the unseen God to the desperate cries of his people. They did not rely on their own strength or cunning. They relied entirely on their God through prayer and fasting. And he proved himself mighty to save, even when the threat came not from an invading army, but from the political tyranny of a powerful king. This story from 3rd Maccabees serves as a powerful reminder. God's protection is not limited by geography or the nature of the threat. Whether facing military invasion in Zion or political oppression in Egypt, when his people remain faithful, trusting in his power rather than their own limited resources, he is always ready to deliver them, often in ways that are unexpected, dramatic, and undeniably miraculous, proving his absolute sovereignty over all earthly powers. Thank you for watching this video. If you find the content interesting and meaningful, don't forget to click like to support me. Leave a comment to let me know your feelings or the topics you want to see in the next videos. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any new videos from me. Thank you very much. See you in the next videos.